Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Monday. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 910th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Tony Coates and Zoë Hopkins. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Sasha Banks here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Tony Coates lives and works in Providence, Rhode Island, where he serves as professor in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. Coates received the 2022-23 Rome Prize and currently has a solo show at Dia Bridgehampton. His work is in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Centre Pompidou, LACMA, MoMA, the Whitney, and other institutions. Zoë Hopkins is a writer and critic based in New York. She received her BA in art history and African American studies from Harvard, and now she is currently working on her MA in modern and contemporary art at Columbia. Her writing has been published in the Brooklyn Rail, Art Forum, Cultured, and Hyperallergic. It is such a huge honor and pleasure to have you in conversation today on the NSE. And with that, I'm excited to pass it over to you, Zoë.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for that introduction. And Tony, I'm just deeply honored to be here with you today and excited for what's about to unfold. So first and foremost, a sincere thank you for making time.
My pleasure.
So I suppose, should we get the slideshow up first or show the video? Wonderful.
The video.
When my shadow says is a real being chasing me, and there's never enough time to heal. My heroes float as stars. So look up, oh, look up. Don't ever look down, 'cause the ground opens up skies. When love's not around.
All right. So I wanted to just dive straight into things. Give people a sense of what this wonderful exhibition at Dia Bridgehampton is like. Of course, the embodied experience of being there is much different than seeing it on a screen. But just to begin, I'm wondering if you can give a brief framing of the clip that we just saw, and what the different slides are kind of signifying, how things are working together.
Okay. What you just saw was basically early in the second channel of the two-channel piece. I had a number of texts that provided different maybe viewpoints on the histories and the function of the space in which the exhibition takes place. I was particularly interested in the history, if you will, of the Dan Flavin Art Institute as a former Black Baptist church. And I was also interested that certain artifacts and parts of that history were preserved in a room off the main installation space. And it had a kind of influence on maybe the other material that I recruited to the project. The text that you got to see was actually taken from a long series of interviews with Heiner Friedrich, who was one of the founders of Dia. And I had heard that he was a regular visitor to the space, you know, as it continues to develop, even though he's not so much directly involved with Dia. I was interested in maybe the what I thought was intriguing combination of aesthetics, politics, and spirituality in his approach to art and art practice and the founding of that institution. Things are, you know, different in certain ways, I think, today, but I was interested in that as kind of also one of the kind of histories, if you will, of that space and how it has, you know, kind of gone both historically and, you know, perhaps contemporaneously. I was also kind of looking to a number of other texts, including a book about celebrating, I think it was the 20th anniversary of the church, which was, you know, in the 1940s. So something, you know, long ago, but still maybe having certain types of resonance. And I was interested in both kind of the naming of the people involved in the church and also the commercial sponsors of this commemorative book. And I thought it would kind of maybe bring a broader context and a kind of deeper, and for me at least, when I first encountered it, unexpected history. So that was another textual element. And the other is perhaps writing about and writing of Dan Flavin on his practice. So those were kind of basic elements. I juxtaposed them in fragments, as I often do. And I was kind of interested too in the reason that it's a two-channel work is I specifically wanted to use the space in a way that would, I don't know, give greater complexity to the arguments and the positionalities of the different texts.
Great. Yes. And that being said, you know, dialogue is always kind of embedded in your work, whether it's between two screens or between music and text. And I've always really appreciated that your work takes the music as seriously as it does the text, and that the text and the music are kind of co-conspirators in this production of meaning. I was particularly fascinated with your music choices here. So they're vast in their range from R&B to sort of techno and house to gospel. And so I'm hoping that you might be able to frame for us the decision-making that went into your choices about the music, what relationships you're kind of hoping to set into motion between different songs and also between the music and the text.
Yeah, I mean, I think with this project, as with a lot of my work, I was particularly interested in the possibility of using the sonic register as a kind of form of and decontextualization of maybe the visual and textual elements. In this case, as is kind of normative for me, I started off with a massive playlist that I think I wanted it to be varied, and I wanted all of the work in some way or another to reference gospel idioms, but not necessarily only gospel idioms. And so I was interested in things like, floor plan, which, Robert Hood has a very explicit link to gospel and church traditions. And then, works like Gees and Gosh, which sample gospel music, but put it in a, really sort of glitchy early 2000s context. And then, of course, there was something like, what is it, the junior, hold on a second, let me just pull up something. That actually is kind of more direct and maybe a 1960s version. And of course, you have something like our friends from Cleveland, Morning of Black Star, who I, have always thought since I first encountered their work was really amazing. And I was kind of like, well, I didn't get to use it in the project I wanted to use it in. And so I think that was one of the first things I chose. And then I narrowed the, tracks down and narrowed them down some more. And then began to think about like what it would be like to have a single soundtrack for a two-channel work. And it seemed very much like there was a way in which those sounds and their relationship, if you will, to gospel traditions, varied though they may be, kind of gave an interesting sort of series of histories again that I think will complement and complicate the arguments and utterances in the text. So, but yeah,
Yes.
it's
Sorry,
always of interest for me. I'm always trying to find texts that will amplify and complicate one's reading of the textual material, and I felt like there was I guess almost a 60-year span of the music, which also kind of was different than, say, the history of the Dia sort of installation of Flavin's work. And so I thought, having those two histories in two different forms or several different forms, would resonate against each other. And it seems like that was the case for some viewers anyway.
Absolutely. I noticed, if we return to the previous slide, this quote, "We must shock this nation with the power of love," is called from one of the songs that is played in the installation. And that's kind of a singular moment where there is an explicit alignment between sound and text, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, I placed that towards the end of the piece, and the track is by Burial, and he samples an African-American preacher who is giving an introduction, I think, in the 2012 Democratic Convention. So there's a political context as well as a spiritual context, and that seemed to be a really important kind of moment, and it was very, very much towards the end of the piece. And so I thought bringing those things together was, really a kind of important thing to do. And the idea of, that kind of direct connection maybe to church traditions and forms was kind of an important thing to have in the piece. And it was great that it also is a kind of from a electronic music techno kind of context.
Yes. Yeah. And I was glad that it came at the end. That song was, I think, the last song in the that played. And it was such a fitting kind of resolution to all of the other sonic textures that had been introduced. I want to return to the points you were making about gospel, and just sort of linger in that space for a little while. So I learned recently that Flavin himself studied for the priesthood, I think for about 5 years when he was a teenager. And so that, of course, made me think of the work that you're doing, the kind of like spiritual metaphysics that is manifest in these texts, and in the sounds that you're using. And then not to mention the kind of like explicit way that spirituality is built into the site, given that the building was formerly a church. So I just wanted to kind of talk about this cadence of the spirit of religion, and kind of get into your view on the relation between a conceptual art practice and a kind of spiritual ethic.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I don't think I've explored before in my work in a kind of explicit way. I guess it came from my thinking about the importance of light as a kind of medium in Flavin's work, and what it meant to have spent time in that space upstairs. And I was thinking in large measure, would it be possible to explicate and extend some of the things that basically go on upstairs into the downstairs. In fact, the idea that often when you look from outside at the upstairs, there's light emanating from the upstairs. And I thought, would it be possible to tune and approximate that in some way? And so I had the idea of gelling the windows, and also thinking about like the light bleed of having, the projections inside the space and have them, extend over the walls. And that's another reason why I think I was drawn to having two different things going at once, so that would increase, that sort of filling of the space and amplification, of light as a phenomena. And it was, again, it was something that light had been and has been a kind of important aspect of my work, but it kind of came to a very different place within the confines of what, I don't know, turned out to be a relatively small space. And so it was kind of interesting to sort of like try to find ways to enhance the differences that one could produce.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, that dialogue between upper and lower floor sets into motion a kind of, I don't know, a renewed cartography of the museum, almost a renewed way of seeing it, both from outside and from inside, which kind of brings me to this like chicken and egg question of how you arrived at Flavin. Was it first knowing that you would have this installation idea and then wanting to work with Flavin consequently, or were you already thinking about his work before you knew that Dia would be in the picture?
That's a very, very, very interesting question. I mean, I've been thinking for quite some time maybe about my relationships to certain tropes and phenomena having to do with minimal and conceptual art, but I hadn't really been explicitly thinking about Flavin until the possibility of this commission came up. And yet it was kind of uncanny. When I did my first site visit, it was kind of like, yeah, well, there's things and interesting sort of phenomena that I could intervene in relationship to it. But I hadn't actually been thinking specifically about Flavin's work before then. I mean, for me, I think often the encounter with a space and its history or its attributes kind of lead the way. And, it's sort of like I sometimes have very specific ideas about histories and practices, but often seeing a specific work or seeing a specific space in which the work is installed or knowing things about the history of this space, provide a certain type of focus and amplification for those maybe more general sort of considerations. And it's even a little stranger because I'm working on a project that's almost finished that also deals with the legacies and certain attributes, work, actually an encounter with a work that I hadn't previously been familiar with, of Sol LeWitt. So it's kind of continuing, and in large measure, it was kind of thinking about that kind of relationality. And I thought, well, I've done one, maybe I can try another. So
that's wonderful. That's really wonderful to hear about, an encounter with the space kind of galvanizing this deeper, but perhaps latent interest in an artist's body of work, which is kind of making me think about the different texts that you've sourced for this particular installation, many of which I believe are drawn from the archives at Dia.
Yes, it is true.
Yes.
You know,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say I like and appreciate having material to sort of sift through in order to make, you know, the work that I do. And it's like I often can't use all of the material that I'm presented with, but you know, I kind of in looking at the archival material, you know, it suggests maybe multiple sort of approaches and registers, and I'm always glad for that. And it's often more interesting to have that kind of information in dialogue with, you know, in this case, Jordan, who was curating the show. And, you know, again, things came up with other colleagues when I told them that, you know, I was thinking about these things and working on these things. So, you know, other suggestions came up that finally were incorporated into the piece. So, yeah, it's, you know, it's like I often collect things, quote unquote, on my own, but often it's good to have an interchange with colleagues and friends around the things that I'm thinking about and working on. And in this case, it was definitely, those registers were definitely important. It's like not just archival material kind of as background or as inspiration, but also kind of dialogues around what I'm thinking about while I'm doing the work. So
I love this idea of, you know, a collective kind of knowledge production and intellectual labor, particularly given that you're having these dialogues between screens, and then kind of behind the scenes there's this dialogue happening between you and folks at Dia and archives at Dia. The interchanges are multiple. And I think that's what gives the work its kind of underlying generative tensions. I'm curious, you know, you brought up this image earlier of starting with a kind of massive playlist culled from, you know, many different corners of the history of music. Where do you typically start with archives or other sources? Because these are also, you know, very vast materials, and I'm wondering, how do you sort of get your feet wet to begin with?
Yeah, that's hard to say. You know, it almost varies a little bit by project. I think for me, sometimes I collect things. I collect texts. You probably could argue that I'm a music collector, although I'm not as voracious as I was when I was younger, and I sort of miss that. But it's kind of like a sifting process, I think. It's almost like I collect things. I say, you know, maybe this will go into a work at some point. I don't really necessarily know exactly how. And then, you know, if I'm working on a specific project, then I will do something like set up a playlist and think about, well, how could, you know, this track implicate maybe a different register, say on an affective level that the text does not address directly, but kind of works in, you know, tension, sometimes even antagonism with the other material. And then, you know, often I think the first thing, and I say this maybe pretty often, the first thing that I want to commit to actually is the sonic aspect of it. I mean, I know texts that I might use, and even in some cases, I absolutely know the exact text that I plan to use. And so I begin to think about the sound and the musical choices and the genres and the histories in relationship to, you know, various moments or attributes of a, you know, given project. So it kind of goes back and forth, you know. The first thing I commit to usually is an edit of the soundtrack. It may not stay forever, but it narrows things down, gives me a kind of baseline or temporality to work with. And then I began to think about, okay, how am I going to go through the textual references and how they, might inform one another. And then, sometimes there are changes, sometimes tracks come in, sometimes they go out, like the burial track at the end came in toward the end. A friend and colleague, saw Work in Progress and said, have you seen or heard this track? And he even gave me like the second half of the track. And it was sort of like, yeah, the second half works better than the first half. And it seemed to be very much, kind of the appropriate vibe and shift from what, preceded it. And it's great when those things happen. And I try to embrace them when, they resonate and they seem appropriate. And in that respect, I think I'm often lucky, and almost in that kind of Warholian way. It's sort of like I'm talking to people and they're helping me with my work, as opposed to just I don't know, responding to it and leaving me alone with it. It was almost like, yeah, that's a helpful direction or suggestion. And in this case, I think it really did broaden the piece and tie, certain elements and themes together, right?
You brought up a lot of different points, and I'm trying to think of which I want to stick onto first. I suppose you mentioned briefly that you're keen to kind of stir up an affective register through these dialogues between music and text. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, particularly for folks who haven't had the chance to see the exhibition in person. What are the kind of like affective claims that the work is evoking or attempting to evoke? And what is the embodied experience of being in this space like? Of course, it's going to differ from person to person, but if you were to...
I think it will, for sure. But, I would say maybe one thing that's reported to me fairly often is the idea that there might be some kind of bodily response to historical or theoretical or journalistic information. That, that the body is one register of potential knowledge and, hopefully, future action. It's not just fun. It's not just being entertained. It's not just diversion, but it might be a way of thinking and a way, towards action. I would probably say some people don't believe this or don't want to accept that. But, I do think that the body and, say, rhythm are kind of potential ways to knowledge and ways to community. And so if I see, say, resonance between gospel music and ideas about community and the Black Baptist Church and maybe even art practice and institution building, I want to model those possibilities, those possible connections.
Yeah, and I mean, I think your work is always making kind of totalizing demands on our senses. That I think, it's particularly potent in this particular setting where we're thinking deeply about the history of the space, and what's happening on the screen is intimately linked to the site itself. But there is this kind of like, the body is pulled into a relation with the space that becomes almost inextricable when you're in it.
I feel like an immersive experience can be knowledge producing.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, I think, again, question whether it's possible to dance and think at the same time. I really don't have a problem with that. conceptually.
Yes.
And sometimes people, should I be, moving, or can I, and it's sort of like, well, if you're called to move, who's going to stop you? I'm certainly not going to stop you.
Right.
And, it's kind of like, if the space and the relations between the materials, call for a response in the body, and that it might even help clarify, what, say the social aspect of religious practice, art practice, political practice. That seems like a good thing to me, as opposed to, these are things that should be separated and kept separated, as though I don't know, that you can only have these things in a kind of strict separation. It seems like there's a long history of both spiritual and political practice that involves an engagement with the body, and that the body does produce certain feelings, emotions, and thoughts. It's not a one-way or a singular kind of experience that's not part, or separated from the social. I mean, in some ways, it's, kind of a way of calling, people into, consciousness of their relationships with others. And so why should not that be the case? Why shouldn't it be a place where those knowledges can be circulated, recorded, reproduced, and acted upon? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right? There's like this weird way in which minimalism is often historicized as being kind of, purely conceptual. But we forget that it was deeply in dialogue with all these movements, these Fluxus folks who were thinking and acting through dance, through music. So, these practices of conceptual art making have always been very much interlinked with and irreducibly tied to, not only the body, but also what the things that the body produces, movement, sound, etc. There's a line in your videos that recurs over and over. I don't know whether I think of it as a sort of subtitle or not, but there's this line, doing politics with color, that I'm really interested to know more about. I want to know kind of what it means to you, and also what the kind of political conceits of this installation consist of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I sometimes resort to recursive forms, and it's an idea that intrigued me, and it was actually something that came from the previous large project that I had done. And I was like, I want to sort of repeat it and stress it and maybe reconsider it as a concept. It's a line that actually comes from Adel Aischer, a German designer who basically did the color scheme and design profile for the 1972 Munich Olympics. And there was something, in his life and in his project, a kind of desire to lay out a corrective to the 1936 games under, the thrall of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, and to create a kind of post-nationalist, international idea about design. And of course, it always, life is always more complicated, and politics are always more complicated. And so, I don't know, I feel like the possibility of that kind of got undone by, terrorist acts at the 1972 Olympics. But I was particularly interested in the conceit that, for instance, the choice not to have colors that represent national flags or a particular historical period and moment could be political, even if, it's also, complicated, or it could also get derailed by, other circumstances equally political. And so when I was thinking about the use of color and thinking specifically maybe about Flavin's work, it was almost like I was interested in resuscitating, to some extent, that argument that, if a kind of relationship that seems only formal could also be a register, or in relationship to, again, the social, not, something imagined out of historical or out of social context, but something maybe specifically linked to it, and that it might be a possibility, again, worth pursuing, even if there were historical problems and failures in the past, which is maybe to some extent why I also start with good old, it was really interesting, the Heiner Friedrich book had on the back cover, I think, the quotation from Winston Churchill, about repeated failure being, a kind of motor sometimes, as opposed to an impediment to, what people need to do and how they need to think and act in the world. It's like the idea that success and failure are not, kind of strictly speaking, binaries, but may be linked to, what one has to do or what people have to do in order to move forward in a certain sense.
Mm. Mm. And in terms of the politics that this installation is doing, I mean, there's a lot embedded here. The texts are engaging with, questions of the commodification of the artwork, of spectatorship in the museum, accessibility, etc. And so I wanted to think more about kind of the modalities of critique that you're aiming to foreground here, and also whether this could be conceptualized as a work of institutional critique. Is that playing a role at all?
I mean, it's something that, historically and daily, I think about what the conditions of possibility are for making work today, and, ways of maybe constructing relations that, aren't necessarily totally, quote unquote, accessible to everyone, but perhaps, might extend, again, conditions of possibility and roll back and reconsider maybe historical moments or practices that, have been perhaps not read as critically as they might be. And, I mean that in terms too of the whole business of the accusations that, I don't know, minimalism, for instance, is apolitical or
Right.
theatrical.
Mm-hmm.
And that being kind of, again, a critique, of its relationships maybe to the human body, again, embodiment as a problem as opposed to a feature, or something that at least has possibilities and it's not to be, dismissed, or could have, a kind of use value, not just in the past, but potentially in the future. I mean, I think too, part of my, thinking has to do with, it's like, I think you're right about the complex, history and context out of which, say, a movement like minimalism came, that there might actually be performative registers there that are worth, considering, as opposed to, in some extent, denigrating, because they are connected to the body and not, strictly speaking, abstract. And I'm always a little bit maybe polemical in the things that I put together, and would want people to consider, to look at again. I think too, the idea that these are only visual phenomena, and that they would be separated from sound has always been of interest to me. You know, it's like even some practitioners had sound as part of what they did, but not part of the primary aspect of their practice. And that kind of interests me, like a figure like Michael Snow, for instance, who was a musician, but has a lot of films that have no sound, you know, because they're about, you know, what you do or what the meaning is of, you know, a filmic relationship, right? And it's sort of like, I don't know, it's and it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, in the same registers in which sound is often used, you know, in traditional, you know, and entertainment film context. So I sometimes like to explore roads not taken or possibilities in, you know, historical forms and genres, to do things that they wouldn't normally do, as opposed to, yeah, reproducing, you know, all the aspects and all the sensoria that they, you know, historically have done. And, you know, in the same way, it's kind of like why I want there to be a kind of complex relationship to sound, that it's not, strictly speaking, a single genre, and not, you know, the same historical period, say, as the text or the colors, right? I want there to be variations, maybe to, you know, give an indication that there are future use values as well as histories, right?
That's right. And I'm interested in what you said about kind of your practice as not primarily visual, and also how that is kind of historically situated in conversation with minimalism, because there are moments in this installation, and we actually came upon one in that first clip that we showed, where the text pauses, and as viewers were left for a moment with a purely sonic experience of the thing. And I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about what those moments of pause, of breath, in the visual are doing. I mean, the colors continue to change, but the text is arrested, which I find to be a curious, a curious point of kind of tension in the work. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, you know, I think it actually has to do with rhythm and phrasing in the text. I mean, I often make editorial decisions, of course, when I'm, you know, deciding what the duration or what the capacity of a given, you know, a given page is, and where to make the breaks. And sometimes there are actual paragraph breaks in the text, for instance, and, you know, I will approximate those, you know, to kind of give a pause, because there's a pause in a certain sense in the text. It's, you know, I sometimes do it in different ways for different reasons, but, you know, when I usually insert blanks, they usually mark paragraph changes. Sometimes I might have breaks between sentences, but more often it's paragraph breaks. But I think the idea, especially since it's a phenomena, if you will, out of the reader's control, it's good to have some, you know, spaces for reflection or for, I don't know, consideration of what might come next, or a change in register, a change in the source of the text or who is speaking. I just feel like there are bound to be pauses in the text. They are spaces where you can attend to the music, perhaps, and think about its relation to what came before and what may come after. I mean, I've done some work where there's a kind of continuous, you know, flow of text, or things are divided into single words, and some of those are, you know, more difficult as reading processes. But even in those cases, you know, there's got to be a break, because in the text, you know, there's bound to be, you know, it's a kind of structural feature And I kind of like marking it as opposed to, running everything together in kind of continuous. I think it's sometimes maybe hard enough to attend two readings. And there is something people remarked on some occasions that it's a very different experience than, reading a text yourself. And, questions of who controls the reading, the speed, if there is kind of time and space for recursiveness to go back, which are kind of, endemic to readerly control. It's not there in the work, in a certain sense, unless you have a, copy or of the video itself, and you can go back and do that sort of, but there should be some breaks, and breaks I think are productive, not just as, punctuation, but for a lot of other reasons, including, just being able, like I say, to mentally rewind or to project, what's going on.
Yeah, I honestly had no idea that it had that kind of practical function of being a marker of a paragraph break. Because for me, its function is so psychological, and it's one of kind of a moment of where I reorient my relation to the work. And so I had never imagined it as its role within the actual written text. So it's really interesting to hear you frame that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a feature, but I'm sure, its function or its, effect the viewer may be different than, what the place that it marks in the text.
Right. While we're on this slide, I did want to ask about the public facing dimension of the project. So as I understand it, this is placed on a highway sort of nearby the Dia. And I'm imagining, cars passing and folks reading and engaging with the work. But I'm interested to hear how you arrived at this idea, at this particular configuration of installing the work on a highway, and then just generally what your relationship with public art is, how you might describe that.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated in some ways.
For sure.
I see the public as again, like as a zone of potential, and one that, again, often, as is the case with the texts that I recruit to reread, in a way, it's sort of like opportunities opportunities for reading. And public reading is something that is kind of interesting to me, because it seems as though so much of what reading has become has, certain privatized aspects to it, whether it be advertising specifically, or whether it be, the ways in which technologies continue to filter what people read and how they read. It's like the idea of inserting these little aphorisms into the public sphere that are not, quote unquote, strictly speaking, selling anything. They're just, enunciations that appear. And I kind of like the idea too that they appear in this, particular case, especially from a context that may or may not be fully present, to the reader. So for this project, rather than try to provide a summary or all the, fragments of all the things, I kind of chose a particular set of registers, not all from the same text, but things that refer in some way maybe to something that's not a product and not material. So that kind of guided my approach in this case. I've done some things with other sort of interests or filters. I think the project that had a heavy public component before this was for the Carnegie. And I sort of wanted to redirect some famous or infamous utterances. And, it's like I was bored with the I of the personal pronoun and decided to just take these statements, which I think are pretty well known, and just blow out change the personal pronouns to see what, impact that might have in a public context. And then, I've done some public projects that are stills. And so, if they are from a variety of different works, say, as part of the same project, they read as a kind of, I don't know, selective index of some moments from the video. But in an interesting way, at least to me, the context again becomes, more questionable. And it sort of often underlines a general question that I think emerges in the work, and that is, who is speaking, and in what context, to whom, or for what reasons. So those are maybe different addresses in terms of public material. But I'm interested, in maybe just the simple and or complex fact that we're called to all the time in public, but usually from very, very specific kinds of contexts and conditions. Why aren't there more sort of a wider variety of public calls?
That's a really interesting question. And I mean, to think of this work as like kind of an interpolation or an invitation into this discursive space, which, might be thought of as belonging purely to the institutional or purely to questions of the museum. But I think something really interesting happens when you invite this work into the public, and B, as you were talking about, this kind of like depersonalization, absenting the I from the text. You've also done this really interesting gesture, which has appeared in a couple of your works, where names are reduced to initials. And I know we have some questions in the chat, so this will be my last question for you. But I wanted to ask about that tactic of kind of reconfiguring the signifier of a name into an initial, and also leaving out kind of citations or footnotes, or, we don't, as you said, we don't know as viewers where these texts are coming from necessarily, unless we've, listened to this conversation or read the press review or something.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a hold on you. You've asked a few questions. I mean, sometimes I'm interested in like the quality of reading of a particular text or set of text. And so sometimes I feel, or, it's kind of maybe an intuition of mine, I don't know whether it's a fact or not, that it's useful to kind of look at maybe the structure of certain accounts and narratives. They're tropes in a certain way. And it's easier to do that if you're not necessarily distracted by what you think you know already. And so just maybe a little bit of distance can help clarify that maybe this is something that you've seen in a different form before. If you stick with all the information, you think it's a quote unquote isolated or specific incident, and then you pull back maybe from what you know, and you might be able to see that it relates to other, descriptions or other statements in public. Or, yeah, I mean, one maybe example is that I took a couple of, multiple incidents of people saying outrageous things in public. And if you don't, immediately identify who's saying it, you kind of get to a recognition, or a potential recognition anyway, of what's being said and how it's being said. And, it's sometimes it's almost impossible to do that if you're attending to, upfront who said it. You kind of almost suppress the specifics or the generalities of what's being said, because you think something based on, attribution, kind of direct attribution. So I'm kind of interested in what happens if you suspend the attribution. It's not like I want to keep it a secret, locked away forever, or, I want people to, go on, some sort of guessing game or treasure hunt. It's almost as though, could we just for a few minutes suspend what we think we know about, about statements, especially public statements. I think it may at least allow the possibility of seeing, some aspect of their construction and contextualization, how they operate. And so, I don't know, it's a tactic that I have used. I'm kind of, interested in, how these things become meaningful, or how we think we understand them, or what we think we know about these, public statements, who gets to make them, under what circumstances. One thing that I have a particular interest is in, artists and or creative people, and, saying, ridiculous things in public seems to be, again, a common trope of getting attention. It's sort of like, is that really necessary? Is that really part of, cultural practice? What is it? Is it a seeking of attention? And if so, is it really necessary? How crucial is it to cultural practice?
Wow. Oh, you've given me so much to think about, Tony. I'm feeling really so enriched by this conversation, and hope that it continues, offline at some point. There are so many questions.
That would be great, Zoe.
Wonderful. Well, you have my contact information, so we'll figure something out. But for now, there are so many questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that the audience has time to, ask what they want to ask. So I will stop talking and turn it over to them. But before I do so, I just want to say, truly thank you so much for this conversation. It's been just a treat, and an unforgettable one at that. So
thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you for the questions and the attention.
Of course. And thank you for the work, and everyone go see it. It's marvelous.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoe and Tony, for this amazing, really generous, thought-provoking conversation. We do have a bunch of great questions from the audience in the chat, and the first questions will be from Chloe. I'll pass it over to you, Chloe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony and Zoe, for today's conversation. We had a question come in from Jacob Bromberg that I'm going to ask on Jacob's behalf, because they are with loud, small children. But in addition to that, I'm going to add my own question to it, because they're related. So Jacob's question is, they are wondering, Tony, how you create and navigate your collection of texts. I imagine that the sheer size of the collection would make finding passages to use an exceptionally long endeavor every time you set out to create a new work. And my addendum to that is, can you tell us a bit about the studio process, and even how many iterations of the work at Dia Bridgehampton you made before getting there? What that iterative process is in making each of the works.
Oh boy. I'm one of those people who believes in, if it's really resonant, you remember some trace amount of it. I'm not as organized. My wife is a practitioner also, and she is a collector primarily of images, but sometimes of text. She's extraordinarily organized, and I'm not. I know, for instance, if I'm working or thinking about a topic, I think about, is there a specific or a set of qualities that a text may have? And I seem to have some kind of reflexive memory for that sort of thing. So it's not like I keep careful notes of what, each, text does and how it operates. It's more by feeling. And also through a kind of process, I guess, of accretion. It's like I've looked at a certain number of texts on this topic, and I have a sort of feeling after a while for what this text does, how it operates. For instance, I can tell you about certain projects. A project like Evil 16 torture music, for instance. It was like I read some academic things. There was, new bodies of scholarship on, the use of music in enhanced interrogation or torture. It was all very interesting, but it was like it almost seemed not really complex in its registers. And sometimes that's okay, because I will put together 2 or 3 texts that maybe do different things, and through the sort of interplay and the differences, between the approaches, you'll get something. But sometimes you find, or at least I found, a text that does multiple things simultaneously. And the text I recruited for that project, it was like I had read the academic literature, I'd read the in some ways horrific journalistic responses. And it was like, oh, well, this, not only covers the journalism, critiques it, but also contextualizes it in what I found to be compelling and interesting theoretical ways. So it's like, wow, the text is doing everything I would do if I edited, this material. This might have, good attributes for juxtaposition and for, kind of complex and compelling argument. So that's maybe one, example of how things get made. Other times, it is one text that does one thing, but in juxtaposition, say with music, carefully, crafted playlist, and sometimes whole tracks and sometimes only parts. If you find an article that's super explicit and goes into detail about a phenomena, and you compare it with, say, a playlist that takes you through a series of thoughts and frameworks that maybe cause you to question, are these two things talking about the same thing, or are they talking about radically different things? That too can be a kind of compelling structure. And that's kind of the approach that I did on with relationship to Free Britney. It's like one day I was listening to the radio on a Sunday morning or Saturday morning, and people were talking about this phenomena, and I was like, what? It was kind of like, and it wasn't even a kind of heavy research thing. I just saw this, this one article that was being recounted on the radio, and I said, I didn't know very much of this, and people, of course, believe in fans and yeah, conspiracy theorists also believe that the evidence was in the music, not just in the sort of historical or journalistic record. And so the juxtaposition was kind of very, very powerful, even though everyone, lots of people claim to know the music, and of course lots of people claim to know the story, which I didn't. It was sort of like I had to inform myself. It's like, what happened? She's been more than half of her adult life has been spent under these conditions. It just was kind of like, so yeah, some different things at different, different projects. Sometimes, I compile, just keep compiling on, subjects, and then, I either find the right text or something comes to consciousness from having looked at a bunch of texts on a particular subject that, I need to go back, I need to find that, the one that I'm thinking about now, even though, I collected it 2 years ago. And then some come out of, a process, where I'm asked to consider a question or an institutional history or a body of work. And yeah, it's sometimes, again, a kind of accretion process. It's not one thing, it's how one thing relates to another thing and to a third or fourth thing. So sometimes it's, a singular event, and other times it's like the concatenation of several things that may not be directly, that may circle around a topic, but are not necessarily directly connected to each other.
Thank you so much, Tony, for answering our questions. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Eleanor.
Thanks, Jacob and Chloe, for those wonderful questions. And thank you, Tony, for that great response. Our next audience question today will be from GE. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you so very much, Eleanor. Thank you, Zoe. And thank you, Tony, for so long being such an inspiration in so many ways. I want to know, in the way that your work transverses the social, political, and the spiritual, all of it, flying right across it, and the way that it seeks to sort of rectify traumas, do you in any way see your work as sort of a theater of sound and vision?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think so on some level. I very rarely do pieces that are silent. Sometimes I have almost in a kind of, what's the best word? Willful response to expectation or desires on my part or on someone else's. But yeah, I think I do want to explore the possibilities of a kind of rich and immersive set of relations. I mean, I also have a kind of counter tendency where I want to make things appear to be very simple, or to drop out certain things that, have preoccupied me, so that maybe I can get at some other approach to the sensorium. I mean, I've done projects, for instance, where, almost on a dare, I considered the possibility of what would it be like to go through a group of works one by one in terms of their content, but have an array of visual input, just not, content driven. Essentially, putting something in the context of blinking colors, for instance. And so, you're kind of pointed to the one that has content. Different things that I would never do, or things that, are almost like, well, I can rethink the direction, say, of aligning things. For instance, one of the reasons I'm kind of fascinated with doing two-channel works, things that have relations, but they're not necessarily linear relations, that they work around and over themes, but they're also disparate and spatialized from each other, as opposed to all on one screen, all in a kind of linear order. For me, I think it's, trying to take maybe simple techniques and make them more complicated through juxtaposition or displacement. So yeah, it's like, I want it to look simple, but I also want it to be different than what I did before, or take up, certain techniques, but at a different level, or in a different order, or in a different sort of relationship of address. I mean, lately I've been thinking a lot actually about the book as a form, because a lot of my material comes from books, or the newspaper or the magazine. So those forms and formats, are kind of raw material for me. And so I've been, trying to think about ways of making books, and also taking some of the technological and production possibilities of books and putting them back into installation practice. So one thing I was thinking about over the weekend with a colleague was, would it be possible to take either existing works, maybe more than one existing work, or new material that might be thematically related to an existing work, and create something that's nonlinear, that actually kind of rehearses different approaches and different framings of maybe a question or a particular genre. And so that, what you would see at any given time would only be a kind of fragment of something that continues to operate, as opposed to, something with a beginning, middle, end, at least in structural terms. So those kinds of, I guess you think about something, and then you think about it again and think about, well, could it have a different form? Or why does it, stop here? Or can you approximate the experience of walking into a room with a work in progress and say, this is the form of a book, right? That it's a fragment from something larger, and that it can never be, quote unquote, complete. And those are questions that, I'm thinking about. I don't know whether I'm going to, resolve them in the form of a given piece, but, I'm trying to think in more complex ways about what everyone claims are simple, or things that they claim to know. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, GE. That was a wonderful generative question. And thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Next question is going to be from Ian. And Ian, you should be able to have the mic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks y'all for putting this together, and Tony for speaking with us. So I'm a library worker, so I definitely come to this work kind of with an archive or library perspective or lens. And I've often kind of thought of your work as almost like an artistic manifestation of the work it takes to surface things from the archive and the political dimensions of the archive itself. But kind of with that lens in mind, I would love to know how your relationship to libraries and archives has informed your work, and how that relationship has developed as your work has developed over the years. So thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Thank you actually for the question. It's funny, I was never a professional librarian. I almost decided at one point that maybe I should get an MLS and become a librarian, because it was kind of one way that I was able actually to both support myself and to get access to materials and colleagues. I worked for several years in the NYU Media Library, and through kind of strange luck and serendipity, I was the clerk in the media department. So I ordered films, reviewed them, talked to faculty about their, needs and desires. And also, of course, I was able to make some work using those facilities. And so they, in a certain way, they were kind of important part of my development, I think, as an artist. I had been interested in, archival or material from popular culture, for instance, before, but I think it really both intensified my interest and gave me access to things. And, for good or ill, I guess it also, kept my music collecting, media collecting, and book collecting going. So now I'm no longer involved in the archive in that way, but I think it did kind of get me going, sort of like in the space between leaving school and, practicing on a kind of daily basis. It was a kind of important space to pass through, as it were. It also brought me, first into contact with the personal computer. It was kind of like an interesting job in that way. I think, but yeah, I'm not maybe systematic enough in my collecting to, consider myself a great, librarian or archivist. That's one of the reasons why I'm glad sometimes I do encounter people who have more of a kind of organized approach to material than I do. But yeah, it's definitely informed the way I work, and like I say, it provided opportunities to get some important works done. And it was yeah, it was interesting. An early work like Black Celebration was, I visited the National Archive to look at, these newsreels, and I was particularly maybe interested in them because I'd seen the same footage in television broadcasts, and also because the context in which they were reused was different than their original context as newsreels. And so I began to kind of bounce back and forth between, how I had seen these, later versus what their original quote unquote state was. And so those kinds of, differentiations, again, were kind of important to thinking about how to go about doing things and how one might recontextualize those materials yet again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian, for that really thoughtful question and that really insightful answer, Tony. Thank you so much. Our final question today will be from Fong, our publisher and artistic director. Fong, you have the mic.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Tony and Zoe, for compelling conversation. Sorry, I didn't hear the whole time because I was being distracted by too many calls and meetings and whatnot. But I wanted to ask one question in regarding that there's a certain kind of casual precision in the way that you place the text, I mean, I heard the reference, of course, to the abjectness of flavor and whatnot, but I feel there's a certain kind of dissonance in the way the light and the font correspond to each other. And I can't help but lately, the last week or more, I've been obsessed listening to Skip James, one of my favorite Delta blues master.
Okay.
And there's a certain kind of broken rhythm to his rhythm. I mean, the way that his lyrics, the way he sung, the way he played the guitar. And so I wonder, first of all, what font are you using, Tony? It's very important to know for me. And I noticed that the way that they constructed on the wall is not center, not according to center axis, to get people attention. That's what I'm saying. By doing it, in a way, you draw more attention to it. It's like, I guess it's Audre Lorde. I'm paraphrasing her most famous, you could never succeed, dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools,
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, the font, the placement of the font is so precise. And it's because it's not trying to capture the viewer attention. By doing it, you actually succeed in getting people to look at it. So
that's maybe a particularly apt description. And maybe it counts for the fact that so many of my my friends and colleagues who are designers seem to be fans of the work. It's almost like you're practicing something, but you're practicing, kind of, I guess, someone like Dan Graham would say, in an amateurish way. I'm doing it because, I'm trying to get some things out. I'm not doing it because it's, calculated or, designed to have, particular impacts. Again, I think there is something kind of casual or willful about my approach to things. It's almost like, practicing certain media forms without the requisite, or the normative attention. It's almost like, people should know how to do this. There are people who do this, and yet it's kind of uncanny, that and I was like, I would think that designers would hate it, because it's not.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I was thinking the same thing.
And it's like even the font choices, people will fuss over fonts, kerning, getting specialized fonts that have specific histories or specific affects even. It's like, oh, this is like, all of this is default, these are, commonplace, from one context or another. But for whatever reason, they're kind of galvanized by it. I haven't quite figured it out myself, but it's interesting to me. Like,
well, I think the fact that you haven't figured out yourself in that sense, I mean, I don't want to use that term again, casual precision, but there's a certain kind of anti-Bauhaus graphic sensibility or structure or design, that somehow drove you in more, because
possibly, again, it's perhaps one of those sets of tropes of modern practice that, I want to do something else or more with. I mean, I think I am motivated to some extent by the desire to, it's almost like I think modernism can be great, but it also historically, and maybe it has something to do with, the history of certain pedagogies and cultural movements. It could be even greater, would be my argument. It could be even more complex as opposed to only simpler, And so, it's almost like part of, I think, my engagement, for instance, with sound is precisely because it is absent from a lot of, high modernist practice. It's almost like you get this thing where the film is silent. It's composed of, maybe rigorously composed and rigorously edited images, but it doesn't have any sort of complication or counterforce. It doesn't. Well, sometimes it does nominate a gap, but in a strange way, I feel like, the practices that I'm interested in, say, in visual culture, could have more complex relations. And part of that is, one of the reasons why it's sort of like I want sound to be a component. I want it to be, an organizing principle and a, affective complicator. And, often, say strict modernism wants to eliminate those things, as noise or interference or the popular, the lame, the regressive in certain ways. And I guess I've just never been a believer, in that. I mean, I think, of course, there may be limits to commercial forms, but there might be possibilities or desires that are encoded there also. And so this idea that, you just need to limit everything to, I don't know, it's, it's like when, as a student, I would hear people talk about the essential features of a given medium. It's sort of like, I don't really care about, it's sort of like I'm interested in the gaps or the questions or the undecidability of, is it this or that? or how does this function, you know, in a kind of complex way, as opposed to, you know,
Yeah.
trying to eliminate everything, you know, that's quote unquote potential interference or potential noise. It's sort
Yeah.
of like noise can be engaging. It can, you know, be as much of an attribute as beauty and silence might be, you know. It's just that, you know, I think people would need to think about those conditions of possibility yet again. And so, you know, it's again, I love simple forms and I love, you know, reduction in certain ways. I just want to add layers of it so that maybe it, you know, makes more complex connections and potential references, which I think is, you know, some would argue a modernist, you know, concern with noise or with, you know, and I can think of, you know, movements like Fluxus, for instance, that encourage, you know, those kinds of things. So
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the potential you know, the potential occurrence or happening and whatnot, without the need to be in label, you know, that's a thing. And in that sense, you know, being in that specific space, I think that cryptic, broken rhythm dialogue between sound and that casual precision, it's really compelling because it's kind of make you look at it slowly, more prolonged viewing as an experience. So yeah, I go see the show, you guys. Congratulations, Tony.
thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm so happy that you finally come on our NSE, and looking forward to read the edit version when Joy get her hand on it. So thank you so much. Back
You're
to
very
you.
welcome.
Thank you so much, Fong. That was a lovely note to end on. And as is tradition here at the Rail, we will be concluding with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Sasha Banks, to the stage. Sasha Banks is a Pushcart nominated poet whose work has been published or is forthcoming in The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, PBS NewsHour, and elsewhere. She received her MFA from Pratt Institute. She is a Rhode Island Writers Colony Fellow and the creator of Poets for Ferguson. She's also the author of America Mine. Thank you so much for being here, Sasha.
Thank you so much. I actually realized maybe a few minutes ago that this is the first reading that I've done probably since my first book came out in 2020. So thank you again to the Brooklyn Rail for this invitation. I'm going to be reading from two different texts. I'll be reading from my newest work called Sing Into My Mouth, which just was released a few weeks ago. And then I have my book all ready to go to read a few pieces from my first book, America Mine. The first piece I'm going to read to you is called If He Won't Be Free, I Do Not Want Him. It is a loveless act to protect any man who bends back his leg to make his beauty illegible. He sees a rose and says, femininity. I say femininity and see everything. There are dead men writhing in the water, in the street, yelling their death, death all over my face. They perform their lessness for each other. My brother recounts the time he made a fist, forgetting when he became one for his father's sake. I have kissed a man who would not cry. I brought him love. He brought salt. I say, I don't want to teach anyone how to be a human, and my mother sighs, my unborn weight. The history is not beyond me. The monstrous shapes it presses into our unforgetting bodies. There must be a man with his hands open, freshly trembling with the letting go of tyranny, somewhere, prying each curled finger from a fist and naming himself. I'm going to read one more from this particular collection. It's called I Thought I Could Wish for Trouble and It Would Not Come After Adjoa Grieves. An open mouth begets all futures. Ours will begin with a death, the signature blood of an ending. I was just a woman twisting her hair in the kitchen, suddenly daydreaming of a row of drinking glasses dangling off the edge of a dining room table, obsessed with the slowing second before the sound. In December, I stood in front of a US map, confessing to it, I don't want a country, only the land beneath it, and watched it fall to dizzy pieces. In March, everyone I loved hid their bones in houses. Death screamed faceless in the night, and no one slept. In April, my heavy head forgets about seasons, even as the earth heals without us, even though my body weaves some new trauma I cannot begin to unravel until it is the garment I wear under my clothes for the rest of my life. I want to hold my lover in May. My trembling hands know he's missing from me. I chew a watermelon rind and wonder if his body has begun to mourn my living flesh. I have craved endings in my sleep while resting on the supposition of children, a well body, some vindicated heart unscathed in the midst of a chaos I have called to me like a vulture to my steady arm. I am not God, and I am no patriot, just seething and exhausted. And that is all it takes to wish for trouble. The trouble is we are all reaping. And then I have a few pieces that I'll read from this text, which is America Mine. And that is my first collection that came out in 2020. So the first piece I'm going to read is a suite of poems. It's 2 poems, or we like to call them sister poems in the poetry world. The first one is called Negromania, and the second one is called Negromancy. King Kong climbs the Washington Monument, and the seat of the Lincoln Memorial is empty, and the reflection pool is grim with crows, and the laughter of 2 ghosts haunts Jefferson's memorial as they swallow nickels into their veiled throats. And Fanny tramples down Pennsylvania Avenue, stopping to pull the Capitol steeple from her giant's foot. A long shadow over Aunt Jemima and Mammy sunbathing on the White House lawn. When Jemima winks at Jessie, painting a picket fence with the blood of Jesus. And the Sphinx has pissed on a rug in the Oval Office. And Ayanna is twirling on the roof of the Pentagon, shooting seeds from her mouth until she spins in a grove of watermelons. And God parts her hair down the middle, greasing her scalp on the Supreme Court steps. Betty Hemmings was enslaved in Virginia in 1761 to John Wales, who fathered 6 of her children. His daughter Martha and her husband Thomas Jefferson inherited Betty and her children, including her daughter Sally Hemings, who had 6 children fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Fannie Lou Hamer was a civil rights leader and activist who addressed Mississippi's Democratic Convention Committee in 1964 with a speech on the violent resistance she encountered in her effort to register to vote. Her speech garnered great attention and press coverage, which was interrupted and redirected at the request of Lyndon B. Johnson. Jesse Washington was 17 years old when he was tried and convicted for murder in Waco, Texas in 1916. He was sentenced to death and immediately lynched over a bonfire in front of City Hall. His remains were collected as souvenirs, and photographs of his lynching were printed and sold as postcards. Ayanna Stanley Jones was a 7-year-old girl shot and killed by Officer Joseph Weekley during a raid in Detroit, Michigan in 2010. He was cleared of all charges. God shouts at a kink snagged on her comb, and Ayanna sings, "Black cat cross my path, think every day is gonna be my last. Lord, have mercy on this land of mine. We all gonna get it in due time." And the Sphinx recites the Gettysburg Address, and Jessie asks for a cup of water, and Mammy leans in, says to Jemima, "That mouse, gonna swallow the house cat." And Fanny howls when she finds an earth stuck to a piece of hard candy in her front pocket, and 2 ghosts are heard calling out the names of the young and dead, and the crows confess that they have teeth, and Lincoln's seat is still empty, and King Kong whispers the name his mother calls him. I have just a few more for you. This next one is called America Collapse, number 2. I saw a city crumbling into the mouth of a many-headed beast. The beast was not the terror, she was my cousin. The terror was the sudden knowing that all empires are made of paper and damned religions. I will tell you the horror, and that is of the crumbling cities. That is of the crumbling city's silence. Yes, its people had mouths, and yes, they were stuffed with the broke off limbs of the conquered, refusing their shouting breath. Elbow, elbow, fibula, knee. The innocuous become the silencer, the way the small do become the mighty with new big bodies and opposable tongues. Everything does weep, but oh, how it growls when the wailing is done. If anger on the other side of fear is rage, the city was delivered to death with savage conviction. I saw the beast lick the sinew from her jaws, and the city, it was still and clean and new and clean and bright and clean as the blood on my face. Let's see. The next one is, okay, so in this book, there are a series of poems called Post-Collapse. So that was the first one. This is another one called Post-Collapse number 3. You will remember nothing but the taste of salt and how it's in everything and how it never changes, even though everything else does. And so you will cry and be fed. A woman will stand in the street and open her mouth one summer night, noiseless for hours until she retches up a star, hot thing covered in mucus. I want to say something like, it turns out that the sun had a face which implies a mouth that knew all your names. But the truth is there will never have been any sun, only the North Star after all. It will fall down and land behind a woman's house in Detroit. It will be dark for weeks and everyone's eyes will glow. Here and now will be the faded kind of memory, like waking from a dream that loosens its grip as you become wider and wider awake. At the grocery store, you'll hear someone whistling the old anthem. They will not be able to remember more than, oh, say, can you? Nobody will. Such is the case with ruins, ancient histories, blurry faces everywhere smeared by the fists of their conquerors. Before today ends, statues will be plucked from their high places all over the country. This should be the first sign, but whiteness will not see itself in this sure demise. They will learn there will be no flag anymore. Many will dream of eagles eaten by crows, pecked to death by crows. A woman will tell of seeing a crow pulling all the feathers from a dead eagle. None will remember this time, but the crows will. And so they will eat the grudge for your sakes. America will be done, and you will know it when the Statue of Liberty sits down to wash her face in the Hudson. Her skin will be black. Your grandmothers will weep. Last two. This one is called The Founder's Farce. Once upon a time, Christopher Columbus sneezed and the constellations were formed as George Washington stood below them and chopped down a cherry tree to build the ark. The rain came and bled on everything, swallowed Robert E. Lee and spit him out onto the shore where the Wright brothers spotted him from their hot air balloon just before crashing into the thick of Yellowstone Park. The commotion startled Lewis, who ran to find Clark, who was at that moment building a log cabin, and the quake was so great it shook the land into 50 pieces, and the states got their shapes when suddenly a thread of lightning slid across the sky, striking Benjamin Franklin right between the eyes. And from that day on, all his dreams were premonitions. One night, he dreamt of iron stitches holding the West together, and in the morning, the railroad was sewn across the Mississippi River, into which John Rockefeller had just tossed his third penny when the spirit of St. Louis came floating up from below the current, saying, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, of all your wishes I may grant one." Rockefeller cried, "I wish my hands were made of money." And in a blink, his palms turned to bills and his fingers coins. He buried them into the soil, and a plume of oil shot from the ground, ruining Betsy Ross's best dress. She quickly began a new skirt, stitching a pattern so beautiful she hung it in her window for all to admire, including her neighbor, John Wilkes Booth, who waited for nightfall to thieve the skirt from her window, where Abraham Lincoln, out walking his Cocker Spaniel, stood mere feet away, watching the skirt be carried off. He confronted Booth, saying if it weren't returned by midnight, he would announce to everyone what Booth had done the following week at the town hall meeting wherein the country would finally be named, but Booth refused. Days later, John Hancock stood before the town and drew the country's name from a hat of suggestions written on slips of paper. In his hand was the inscription Marigold, but on account of his failing eyesight and the author's scribbled cursive, he misread it America. And as the town applauded, Abraham rose to his feet and began, 4 days and 7 hours ago, our neighbor John Wilkes, when just then Booth leapt out from behind the shadows and fired a fatal bullet into Abraham's chest. Booth was swiftly apprehended, and at his funeral, Abraham's casket was draped with Betsy's stolen skirt, which the townspeople declared the official American rag. And the last one I have for you is post collapse, number 4. Endings exist, ripped curtains, shock, and chrome and clay and captives and coconut oil. Patriots are vanishing or existing less and less. Aftermath. Magnolias exist. Their misty breath exists, and whatever bodies held below them are held still and always. Light caught in a mirror is held. A daughter's name held in a mouth. A daughter's hand held at a crosswalk. Crosswalks exist. 808s exist. Subwoofers, streets, sidewalks, and saints. Saints and sidewalks exist, pavement, parked cars, patrols, vanishing or existing less and less. Water exists and thirst on the tongue. Thirst exists, and doors and demons and decisions exist too. Danger exists. Hush, hush is vanishing. Fences and maps vanishing too. Little men and their little militaries are vanishing or existing less and less. You stand at the bathroom sink, brushing your teeth in the mirror when you notice the reflection of some bygone era walk across the floor of the hallway behind you. You turn around. She shows you her hands, muddy, vines under her nails. You face the mirror and she is gone. Hands exist. Hands, hoodies, hymns, hind legs, and ha-ha. Ha-ha exists. Victory and violins too. 808s and dancing men, full as a magnolia with the wind in its hair exist. It's joy. And that exists too. Aftermath. Living is loud, but not the way dying is loud. On the ground, some found magic. The sound of prayers exists. Round bellies of children exist. Children exist. Aftermath. There is your mother under a streetlight, calling your name after sunset, and you answer. You answer. Answering exists. Answering exists, which means the living exist. Existing exists. And maybe so much death is vanishing or existing less and less. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Sasha, that was so stunning. Thank you for that incredible reading. It was such an honor to hear your words. Definitely check out Sasha's book, everybody. And a huge thanks again to Zoe and Tony. And also thank you to Juliet and Alana and the team at Greene Naftali for supporting us in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, as well as for supporting our growing archive, which you can check out on the YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted shortly. For the past 22 years, The Rail has been a platform for arts, culture, and politics and our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our work. And stay tuned for the October issue, which is dropping, I believe, tomorrow. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Michael Rockowitz and Anne C. Collins on the event of The Monument, The Monster, and The Maquette at Jane Lombard Gallery. We will conclude with a reading by Emily Yoon. And join us also on Saturday night from 6 to 9 p.m. for the opening of Singing in Unison Part 8, Between Waves, at 900 3rd Avenue in Sunset Park. Hope to see you there in person. And thanks for tuning in today, everybody. You can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much. Enjoy the sunshine. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasha, for your
Thank you,
reading.
Zoe. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you so much, Zoe.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Zoe.
Take
Thank you
care.
for the reading.
Have a good one, y'all.
Thank you for the reading. Thank you,
Thanks
Sasha.
for reading, Sasha.
Congratulations,
Thank you so
Tony.
much, Tony.
Go see the show, everybody.